Okay, so this next session is all about the Phase 2 review process, which I think should be something near and dear to you. We're going to run till about 11:50, and then Anna will make some announcements about a session afterwards, following session. So, if I can get this to work, where I need to point it. Okay, so the structure of the session today will be, first of all, I'll give you a brief presentation on the Phase 2 review process. We'll go through the financial and administrative review, which is probably a bit of a mystery to most of you, and then talk about the commercial review. So I'll talk about those things, which hopefully will give you some insights into the whole Phase 2 review process. And then we have two very experienced commercial reviewers here who will take questions and answers in the discussion that follows. So most of this will be Q&A, and that's the most interesting part of the session, quite frankly. So let me kick off with a little bit of information about the Phase 2 review process. Okay, so as I said, I think for most of you, the Phase 2 review process, what goes on once you submit your Phase 2 proposal is a bit of a mystery. So in this slide, what we've done is just highlighted the sequence of events, the sequence of main events that occurs after you submit your proposal. So I'll just quickly run through this, just in order that you have a good feel for what actually happens after you submit your proposal. So first thing is, of course, the proposals are screened and sorted into panels, and we'll recruit reviewers for the Phase 2 proposals. Generally speaking, in Phase 2 review panels, we have a mix of technical and commercial reviewers. Usually it's about 50-50, not necessarily exactly that, but roughly 50-50. And of course, the panelists will review your proposals ahead of the panel. They'll prepare written reviews, just as they did for Phase 1, and they'll also assign individual rankings, or ratings, I should say, to the Phase 2 proposals. So once that's all done, the reviewers will be gathered either live or virtually, and a panel will be held where the proposals will be discussed, and there's a lot of toing and froing between both the commercial reviewers amongst themselves and also between the commercial and the technical reviewers. So there's a lot of interaction at the panels. At the end of all that, there'll be a set of recommendations regarding the Phase 2 proposals on the panel by the panel collectively to the program director. And so if there's some interest in taking things forward post the panel, the program director will contact the relevant companies, and there'll be a series of questions and answers, just as there was at Phase 1. So a due diligence process will be started. If that all goes well, then the program director will recommend a number of proposals for award. And at roughly the same time, the program director will also send a request to each of those companies that's being recommended to prepare and submit a financial and administrative information package. So this is an important step in the process which doesn't exist in Phase 1. So that information package is submitted to the so-called CAP branch at NSF, used to be called CAR, and this is the so-called cost analysis and pre-award branch. So they will review your financial and administrative package, and this is a process which is entirely separate from the SBIR program. So it's a separate process. CAP will review that package, and they will make a recommendation as well regarding your proposal. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So our recommendation plus the CAP recommendation is considered then by the Division of Grants and Agreements, and depending on the outcome of the CAP review and DGA's review of the proposal, you will receive an award at full funding, you'll receive an award at reduced funding, or maybe you'll be declined altogether, in spite of the fact that we have recommended you for funding. So this whole process takes about 6 to 8 months. It's a fairly lengthy process, and you probably wonder what's going on, but in fact there's quite a lot going on under the hood. So let me, whoops. Okay. It's definitely a skill to doing this. Okay, so I mentioned two groups at NSF that you probably are not familiar with. First is the CAP group. This used to be called the CAR group. This is the cost analysis and pre-award group, and this is the branch at NSF that carries out pre-award administrative and financial reviews of proposals. That's what they do. And for the SBIR STTR program, they require a full pre-award review of all proposals. And the reason that they require this, of course, is that you're small companies, you're relatively unknown to NSF. Most of NSF funds universities, which are large, well-known institutions that have a history with NSF. You do not, most of you do not, so you're unknown quantities, and that's why a full review is required. So the other group at NSF that I mentioned was the Division of Grants and Agreements, or DGA, and this is the division that's actually responsible for reviewing and awarding grants and agreements that are recommended by the program officers. So it's important to understand we make recommendations about proposals, we do not actually make the awards. So we make recommendations. In the case of a phase 2 proposal that's being considered for award, we'll recommend it, CAP will review it, they'll make a recommendation, DGA will look at those 2 recommendations and make the final call on what's going to be funded and at what level. So in general, any notifications that you receive, regarding an award or a change of an award or a change of PI, anything like that, almost certainly will come from the Division of Grants and Agreements. It won't come from the program. So, and one thing I should mention is tomorrow there will be an open session. I think Amanda mentioned this earlier. There will be an open session that's attended by both people from CAP and also people from DGA. So this will be in Potomac Rooms 1 and 2, I think, from 10:30 to 12:30. So it's a great opportunity for you to ask questions, any questions that you have about, any aspects of, budgets, accounting, financial, administrative matters. It's a great opportunity to ask these questions directly of the people at CAP and DGA. So do take advantage of that opportunity. Because it's not necessarily easy to contact them at other times. So that's a quick overview of the actual phase 2 review process. What I want to talk about now is the CAP review process. So what exactly does CAP do when you submit this financial and administrative package to them? So they undertake several different reviews as summarized in this slide here. So they undertake, first of all, a financial capability review, which is essentially to determine whether the company has adequate financial resources to perform the award. And you might think, well, that's crazy. I mean, if we get the award, we'll have the financial resources. But there are things that you have to do, outside of just R&D in order to grow a company. So they look to see that you've got either other resources already in hand or the ability to secure further resources if you need them. Second thing they look at is your accounting system. They'll review your accounting system, to make sure that it meets the basic accounting requirements for a federal award. So if you turn up with a shoebox and a lot of old receipts in it, you're probably not going to get an award. You need to have a proper accounting system in place. The third thing that they do is they review the budgets. I mean, we review the budgets before we recommend any proposals for award, and we try and make sure that the budgets are in order. But CAP will review them also, and they will look at them from the point of view of whether the proposed budget amounts seem fair and reasonable. Are they based on certified cost and pricing data, and are they properly justified in the budget justification? As I say, we look at these things too. We try to get it right. Sometimes CAP finds things that we don't find because this is what they do. So those are the 3, and I'll come back to these in a second. Those are the 3 broad reviews that the CAP branch actually performs based on the financial and administrative information that you send to them. I can get this to work. Okay. So there are 3 possible outcomes of a CAP review, as you probably gathered already. First of all, CAP might recommend your proposal for funding at the full amount, which of course is the best outcome. And that's quite common. What's also not uncommon is that CAP will recommend your proposal for funding, but at a reduced amount. And the reductions could be because of salary concerns, could be because of concerns about equipment that you want to purchase, or there's any one of a number of reasons that CAP might decide to recommend funding of your award at a reduced amount. So that happens fairly often too. And the third thing unfortunately does happen, but not so often, and that is that CAP may actually recommend against funding your proposal at all for one of a number of reasons. So that does happen too, and I think it probably happens typically every cycle, but it's not common. So one important thing to appreciate is that when you're in diligence and you're interacting with the program director, it's essentially like a negotiation. We're trying together to get your budgets right, to get everything else right, to get the proposal in order so that it will go through these reviews smoothly. So there's some discussion during that process, and we try and give you the best guidance that we can as program directors. Once CAP comes back with a recommendation, though, that's basically it. So it's very rare that we can modify or reverse a CAP recommendation for a reduction of a budget or for a complete declination of a proposal. So you've got to understand that the CAP process, when the recommendation comes back from CAP to DGA, there's probably not a lot of opportunity to change the CAP recommendation. Of course, if it's recommendation for full funding, that's fine, but sometimes it's not. Okay. Can we save questions to the end? Because we'll have a long question and answer session. So just let me get through this. And if you're still awake, you can ask the question then. Okay, so the CAP process will start typically 3 or 4 months after your phase 2 proposal submission. So remember, in the meantime, we have to recruit reviewers, we have to hold the panels, we have to do some diligence, so it's not immediate. If you receive a request to prepare and submit a CAP financial and administrative package, obviously that's a positive sign, but you have to act on it quickly. So typically there's a 10 calendar day lead time to submit that financial package to CAP. And then in the following 6 weeks or so, it's a bit variable, but in the following 6 weeks or so, you may receive further requests from CAP or from people on behalf of CAP for additional information or for confirmation of certain things that you've said in your financial and administrative package. And sometimes these requests come with very short turnaround times, like 24 hours or 48 hours. So you need to be sure that during that period, roughly 6 weeks after you submit your CAP package, somebody's on deck to be able to handle these questions. So you can't just ignore that emails, for the next couple of months and wait for an outcome. You need to be ready to respond to further questions that may come. And those questions may not be from CAP directly. They may be from a CPA firm that NSF has contracted to work with CAP and undertake some of this work. Because the CAP branch is not a big branch, and they have a lot of work to do. So there's a CPA firm that works with them, and I think. Okay. So let me just talk a little bit more about the 3 types of review that CAP undertakes. So the first was the financial capability review, which is just looking at whether the company has the financial resources to perform the work. And so in responding to this question, in the financial and administrative package that you submit to CAP, all companies must submit financial statements for the last 2 years. If you've had an audit done, you must submit your most recent audit. You're obligated to submit it if it has been done. So if there's an audit there, you need to submit it. And also tax returns for the last 2 years. That's assuming you've been around for 2 years, of course. Now, on the subject of the audit, I just want to note that you're not required to have an audit done. So generally speaking, if you don't have an audit that's already been done, I don't advise companies to get one done because it's expensive and it's not really required. But if there is one, you must submit it as part of your package. Second thing was the accounting system review. So here, CAP looks to see whether the accounting system that you have meets the basic requirements for a federal award. So again, in responding to this issue in your financial and administrative package that you submit to CAP, by the way, I see some people photographing the screens. This presentation will be available to you, so you don't need, if you want to photograph the screen, fine, but you don't need to. You can get this later. No, they don't. They're not pointing the camera at me, Nancy, I can assure you. So in responding to this question, companies need to submit responses to a financial management systems questionnaire, which is Appendix 4 of a particular guide. You need also to submit a sample timesheet, and we can talk about timesheets later if you want. And also, if you have any, you need to submit any prior federal audits and or accounting system reviews that have been undertaken of the company, if you have them. If you don't, of course, you don't have to submit anything. Hopefully by the end of this talk I will have figured out this, there we are. So the third thing I mentioned was a budget review. So CAP undertakes a review of your budget, and they look to see, and actually I should mention that budget, as I said before, budget reductions are not uncommon, and they can be for all sorts of reasons. In my topic, the IT topic, they're usually for reasons of concerns about salary, but they can be over equipment or all sorts of reasons. But in any case, what CAP looks at is whether the costs that you've proposed or the funding that you've requested in your budget is necessary to accomplish the project. So is it all relevant to actually getting the work done? Is it allowable? So some costs are not allowable. You should check and make sure that you understand what is and what is not allowable. Are these costs allocable, and are they reasonable in line with the federal acquisition regulations. And again, you can inform yourself about the FAR if you want. And also, are these costs based on current cost and pricing information, which might be evidenced in terms of invoices, purchase orders, quotations, and so forth. And salary rates are generally justified in the Phase 2 budget justifications by reference to an appropriate BLS standard. So those are as I said, those are the three types of review that CAP undertakes. In terms of general advice about preparing for this review, first of all, if you have any questions, ask your program director early, or you can go directly to CAP and ask them early. And tomorrow is a great opportunity. They'll be here. You can ask them questions directly if you have any questions about the CAP review process. In my view, it's never too early to ask. You should know now what you need to do to prepare yourselves for this package submission, in the hope that you will be requested to actually submit this package. So we have some other. You should also find a good accountant. And if you can find someone with relevant experience with agencies like NSF, so much the better. It's not a requirement, but so much the better if you can. Remember, there are two different types of SBIR funding. There are two different SBIR funding mechanisms. One is an award mechanism, which NSF is an award-based agency, and the other is contract-based. So DoD, for example, is contract-based, which means that they fund companies to develop something very specific that DoD itself wants to use. Of course, we don't do that. We don't want to buy anything from you. In terms of further information, there are two websites listed here. The first is frequently asked questions, and the second is the actual information that you would be, a link to the information that you would be required to submit as part of the CAP review process. So I think it's a good idea to go and look at that website now, and that gives you a good idea of what you'll have to put together if you are requested to prepare and submit this package. If you look at it now, make sure that you are requested to submit a package in the future, make sure you look at it again, because it could change between now and then. Okay. We also have some other resources. So we have a webinar that's available on these two websites, and I would really strongly, I think it's about 40 minutes long, and I would really strongly urge you to watch and listen to this webinar. There's a lot of questions in there which are dealt with, which you're probably thinking about, which are dealt with in this webinar, so I would urge you to go and listen to this webinar. That will probably deal with most of the concerns or questions that you have, actually. If you want to contact CAP directly, the person to contact is Sohail Ahmed, and his email address is here, or the web address for the CAP group is there as well. And I think Sohail will probably be here tomorrow, so you can talk with him directly. Okay. Still haven't mastered this, so I guess I failed the IQ test. Okay, so let's go on and talk a little bit about the commercial review. So remember, this is part of the Phase 2 review process. When a panel meets, there will be a mix of technical experts and commercial experts. Both groups will discuss each proposal. So the commercial reviewers typically will be people who have expertise, in startups, in investments, investing in commercialization of early stage technologies, or possibly expertise in the market segments that are relevant to the proposals that are being discussed. Commercial reviewers may or may not have deep technical expertise. Usually, I think it's fair to say usually not. Although, in fact, I have a number of commercial reviewers who are also very strong technically. So, as I said, the technical and commercial reviewers will review and discuss these proposals at length, and there's usually some interaction between the technical and the commercial reviewers in that process. But there's a very strong focus at Phase 2 in the review process, very strong focus on the commercialization aspects of the proposal, specifically on the commercialization plan, which is a whole section of the proposal. And in fact, the review criteria that the reviewers will use in assessing that really mirror the format of the commercialization plan. So if you look at what you're asked to include in the commercialization plan of your Phase 2 proposal, those are the same things that the commercial reviewers will look at. So that gives you a good idea as to the sorts of things that they will regard as important. Okay. So I just want to go through a few of these specific topics and give you an idea of the sorts of things that the commercial reviewers will consider in assessing your phase 2 proposal from a commercial point of view. So first of all, the market opportunity. Obviously, this is key. And reviewers will look at questions such as, what is the product or service? Who do you think is the target customer? And as I said earlier today, I think for a lot of you, finding the product market fit and identifying specifically who the customer is or are is absolutely critical, and it's probably the hardest thing that you're going to be doing during your phase 1 project. For most of you, the technology is difficult, but you understand what to do to get it done. Most of you won't have experience necessarily in identifying the target markets, the customers, and the product market fit. So reviewers will also, of course, look at the customer needs that your technology is intended to address. There needs to be a need, has to be a need there for your technology, and there has to be a compelling value proposition for you to be able to establish a strong position as a startup company. They will look at not just the addressable market, but what are the trends and the drivers in that market at the moment. So are you moving in unison with these trends and drivers, or are you in conflict with them? And also, what are the barriers to entry for your company into these market segments? And never forget that the status quo is often the most significant barrier to entry. Sometimes it's not your direct technology competitors. So another thing, and this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, another thing that commercial reviewers will look at is the company, the team. I think this is absolutely critical. You've got to have a good team, and I think Ben said it earlier, all these people in your team, the core people at least, have to be totally committed to this. This should be a complete obsession for you to make your company a success. If it's not, then you've reduced your chances of success enormously straight away. So the reviewers will look at the size of the company, the structure of the company, what's the vision of the company, how are people incentivized to be committed to the company, what is the commercial track record of the company. And I have to say, coming into this program, it's not a negative if you don't have a commercial track record. Of course, most of you don't. If you do have a commercial track record, it can be a positive or it can be a negative. And I'm happy to talk about that later, but it's true that sometimes it can be a negative. Reviewers will look at who actually owns the company, who operates the company, who's responsible for undertaking the project and for the outcomes of the project. How are they qualified to do it? Are they qualified to do it? And importantly, as I said before, what's their level of commitment? And also, what additional resources can the company bring to bear on this project, by way of advisors or other features or factors that you can bring to play to improve your chances of success. Okay. Okay, third thing that the reviewers will look at generally is the product or the technology, if you like, that you're proposing to develop, and the competition. So, what is the pain point, the customer pain point that you're addressing? How pressing is that? How does your product or service or platform, whatever it is, address that pain point? And what's the value proposition associated with it? And how have you established that that is a value proposition that your customers see for your technology? It's not just something that you've dreamt up. How have you validated that value proposition? Also, you'll be operating in a competitive landscape. So what does that landscape look like? That's important to understand. Again, you need to include the status quo in there as well, because that's often your major competitor. And how will you deal with maintaining your competitive advantage? And in particular, what's your intellectual property strategy? So it doesn't mean that you have to have patents. Sometimes it's appropriate to apply for patents. Sometimes it's not. And you can ask our reviewers on this question, and you'll get some very interesting responses. And so we don't necessarily look for patents. We look for a well-considered intellectual property strategy, which may or may not include patents. Okay. So financial review, the commercial reviewers, will also look at your finance and revenue model. So the revenue model is actually extraordinarily important, and there's a lot of room in many cases for creativity here. So you need to explain your revenue model and why you think it's appropriate and why you think the market will accept it, your customers will accept it. You also need to provide a pro forma, which is a 5-year pro forma, which is projected revenues and expenses over the next 5 years. So this is like the trajectory that you think the company will follow over the next 5 years. And this is actually, this looks like a very dry document, the pro forma when you see it, but it's actually very important. And I think commercial reviewers, and I certainly, and I think all program directors look at this document quite carefully, because in a way it's how you see your company. What do you think of your company? How's your vision and your aspirations reflected in this pro forma? So, all the assumptions that go into it need to be clearly spelled out on both the revenue and the cost side. And the other thing you need to convince yourselves of, it's not just convincing us, you need to convince yourselves, is that your business is scalable. I mean, if your business looks like a consulting business where your costs scale as the revenues do, it's not very attractive. It's not very attractive to investors. Frankly, it's not as attractive to us either. So there needs to be some commercial scalability there, and you need to look at that as you put your pro forma together. And so also, of course, reviewers will look at what additional funding that you're likely to need, and that should appear in your pro forma too, by the way. But what additional funding will you need? When will you need it? And how will you access that funding? I mean, what evidence can you provide that you'll be able to access that additional funding as and when you need it? And again, we've got a lot of further information actually that you can read and make yourselves more aware of the whole phase 2 process. So there's a number of websites listed on this slide here. The first is in relation to preparing a proposal. The commercial review criteria are listed on the second website. Some details of the review process on the third. And the last one is interesting. So we didn't used to allow this, but we now allow companies to switch from STTR to SBIR or reverse as they're going from phase 1 to phase 2. The only direction it ever happens is from STTR to SBIR. I've never seen one go the other way. And the reason that companies want to change is because at phase 1, if they win an STTR award, it's probably because they propose an STTR, it's probably because they need access to university research facilities, to get that initial technical feasibility established. But what companies often realize during phase 1 is that universities have access to this expertise, yes, but universities tend to be a little bit slower to deal with, a little bit more expensive. And so going from phase 1 to phase 2, where the feasibility has already been established in phase 1, phase 2, you're looking at more sort of pre-commercialization research and development. You don't necessarily need that level of access to those resources, or you can access the resources in some other way. And so companies will often opt to switch from STTR to SBIR and going from phase 1 to phase 2, just to maintain that agility that Ben was talking about earlier, and also to minimize unnecessary cost. So there's some information there. If you are considering doing that, there's some information there that you can read as well. Okay, so through all of this, remember that your program director is a resource that you can call upon anytime, basically. But we certainly advise that you speak to your program director if you're considering doing any of the following things. In fact, you really must speak to your program directors. First of all, if you're considering raising funds using a debt instrument in phase 1, or between phase 1 and phase 2, before you submit your phase 2 proposal, that is, talk to your PD, because that can be a negative in the phase 2 review. If you've been funded by a debt instrument that matures during the term of your phase 2 award, that can be a concern for CAP. So talk to your program director about that. If you're planning to make changes in the company itself, including and in particular a change of the principal investigator, you need to submit a request through Fastlane, but talk to your program director first and make sure that he or she is comfortable with that. We encourage pivots if they're evidence-based, and I mean, a lot of our companies make major pivots to their benefit, but if you are considering a pivot, it'll probably involve almost certainly involve revising your R&D plan and therefore revising your budget. So talk to your program director before you do this and just discuss it, and then you will almost certainly be asked to submit to your PD to submit a revised budget and a revised work plan. If you need more time to complete the work that you started out doing in phase 1, and this applies during phase 2 as well, of course, you can apply for a no-cost extension. But again, talk to your program director first. Just make sure that he or she is on board with why you need the no-cost extension. And generally speaking, it's important to keep your program director posted on significant developments that occur during phase 1. And again, of course, subsequently in phase 2, if you do win a phase 2 award. It's really important. I mean, some companies, for some reason, think that the more they talk to us, the worse it's going to go for them. And it's absolutely the opposite. It's absolutely the opposite. You should particularly talk to your program director, make them aware of concerns that you have. Don't sell to us. Whatever you do, don't sell to us. Tell us what is really going on. The more we know, the more we can help, and the more we understand the context when your phase 2 proposal is actually being reviewed. So it helps us and it helps you if you keep us informed. So that's it from me, you'll be pleased to know. So now we have time for Q&A with our panelists. So please take advantage of this. We have 2 commercial reviewers here who are very experienced. You know, you don't get access to these folks at other times. This is a great opportunity to ask questions. So we'll do introductions in just a second, but there are 3 microphones in the room, one there, one there, one there. What I would ask you also to do is, if you have questions about the mechanics of the program, like, you know, where do I find a pro forma timesheet or something like that, I would leave those questions to the breakout session tonight. You can talk to your PD or just email your PD about those. So let's try and keep the questions now. First of all, keep them concise, because we want as many people to have an opportunity to ask questions as possible. And also try and keep them, if you could, to the questions about the review process, because that's why we have a panel here of commercial reviewers. So, Albin and Antigone, would you like to introduce yourselves? And then could you also, in doing that, could you just talk about, you know, the top 2 or 3 things that you would look for as important signals in a proposal when you're reviewing it from a commercial point of view? Yeah. Okay.
You did have a question earlier. Do you want to wait?
Oh, no, that's fine. Do you want to ask your question first? Yes. Yes. If they're not recommended for funding, they don't go anywhere. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Antigone Payton. I have been a commercial reviewer for Phase 1 and Phase 2 proposals, primarily Phase 2, for I think 8 or 9 years now. At least once, if not twice a year, I come in and work with a particular panel to work through some proposals. My technical background is polymeric chemistry and biophysics, but it's been about 20 years since I've been a scientist and preclinical researcher. So as you might imagine, I know enough to be dangerous and ask a lot of questions of our technical members of the review panel. I actually review a wide variety of grant proposals, so not just analytic instrumentation, which of course is closer to my wheelhouse, but also software-based AI, big data, things of that nature. And I'm a former scientist, obviously, but I'm currently an intellectual property and technology lawyer. And I also owned my own law practice for until very recently, about 18 months ago, when we merged with another firm. So I am acutely aware of the issues that startups and entrepreneurs deal with, having done it myself. And I also work with a fair number of startups on getting to that Series A funding, helping them understand what their IP strategy is. So as you might imagine, when I'm looking at proposals, that is an area that I'm highly focused on. And so to your question about the 2 or 3 things that we talk about and look at, obviously the IP strategy is an important piece that I look at and think about a lot. Another piece, which Peter already mentioned, is the team. And I like to make sure that they have the right people on the bus. Often we see these proposals where we have very strong scientific expertise, but if you're proposing that you go to market in the next 6 months, who are your commercial people? Who's going to deal with operations? Who's going to help you get into your primary market that you've identified? So whether it's through a mix of an advisory board, people who are formally associated with a company and giving you advice, funders who are bringing expertise to the table as well as money, I want to really understand what your path to market is and that you have the right people to help you on the business side. And then the third thing that I'll mention is this wonderful 5-year plan. I call it the 5-year pipe dream. So there is 0% chance that it's correct, But it's really important that we understand the assumptions that underlie your 5-year plan. So let's say you talk about a $5 billion market, and you're expecting to get 10% of that market within a 5-year period. How are you going to get there? I want to understand the plan that's underlying the assumptions, the strategic partnerships, who you plan to sell product to or through, right? So that thoughtfulness is really important when you approach the commercial aspect of the market plan. I want to make sure that you've understood deeply the market and how you fit into that market and your primary and secondary plan for penetrating it. And all of this relates to both the 5-year plan and then your description of your market and your market segment and how you're going to attack it.
Can I just, before Albine, before you introduce yourself, so Antigone, can I just follow up on one thing you said about the team? So it's often the case that, you know, teams going into phase 2 are not complete. So how do you, what do you look for then to give you some comfort that they know how to complete the team to get the expertise that they will need during phase 2?
Well, it really depends upon what they're proposing as their product or their commercialization plan. So, for instance, let's go back to analytic instrumentation for a second. Often these are very, very expensive startups, and I rarely, and in our panel, rarely expects that the phase 2 money is going to really get them to commercialization. So, for instance, even if they don't have a full advisory board that can help them on scale up, for instance, do they have people identified who, once they get their phase 2 funding, they are people who are going to help them in an informal role? If they're talking about going to market a year down the road, I don't expect that they're going to have a salesperson on the team, but I expect that they indicate that as they move forward and get closer to market, they've got some strategic advisors who are going to help them understand how to take that next step and get the right people in there at the right time to do that. Okay. So the short answer is I don't expect a complete team at this point. I expect a lean startup, but I want to hear about what your plan is to build out the team at the appropriate time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Antigone. Albine?
Sure. Albine Martin, and I too have been a reviewer for close to a decade. My own background is about 25 years, a little more in industry, between startup and mid-cap. Which has covered diagnostics, research tools and technologies and therapeutics, and more recently really kind of advancing into digital health, as many of those segments are really emerging into a digitally based outcome. You know, I've also had the benefit in the last couple of years to really observe the operational challenges. So I'm a mentor at Johns Hopkins, and there's been a big push on the innovation environment. So I hope some of my comments will not only embed kind of what as a reviewer we look for, but certainly also being sensitive to where some of the challenges are and how you can reflect that in your application. And then I'm also a member of an angel investment group, and of course the parameters there are a little bit different. So I don't want to take too much more time. I think the two things I might add to is, you know, get your story out there early, right? So reviewers just capture the interest. Even that first page is a really kind of important page. So if you can try to sort of really be thoughtful about extracting what the story is, what the vision is, and, you know, kind of convey the passion. I always feel like that is so important. And we'll talk about it again later. I always sort of start from the back. I look at that first page and I then go to the back because it's very informative in terms of letters of support and really supporting the story that you've put forth.
Great, thanks, Albine. I just want to reiterate, we've got 3 microphones here for questions, so I can't believe nobody has any questions. Shiri?
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking your time, your valuable time to be here with us. So I have a selfish question and a selfless question. So the selfish question is, and Peter encouraged me to ask this, is if justified by the company story and the research done, would you ever fund a hedge fund based on AI technology?
Yeah. You have a good answer?
And just to be clear, I mean, the question is not so much would you fund me, right? But in the sense of, is there a justification for a phase two reviewer in terms of impact on the, impact on society, impact on, et cetera? It's not a standard business model like a business model Canvas would be. It's a 2 in 20 model, which still could nonetheless be the right path to commercialization for a particular innovation. Does that make sense?
So I am acutely aware of the fact that NSF, unlike many of the other agencies that have SBIR and STTR programs, has a very broad mission and keeps a very open mind when it comes to evaluating whether proposals fit within that mission. And that's something we hear from our PMs every time we sit down to talk. With respect to whether something fits within the mission, I think that's for our NSF colleagues to cover. But as somebody who has a passion for AI and deals with a lot of AI technology, now I will say that whatever the vehicle is, I think is less important than identifying the potential beneficial societal impact, whether it's environmental, human wellness, moving consumer wealth from one location to another, right? So getting back to Albin's point, it's about the story, but there's a lot of startup money going into use of artificial intelligence for a variety of different societal problems and really understanding the value that it brings to the table. And I'm aware of at least one AI managed hedge fund in Canada currently that is doing quite well. And I think that really was an aha moment for many people where they understood the power of AI-based data analytics that can help augment human decision-making that has a little more of the street and business sense to bring to the table. So I welcome AI proposals and as a general proposition. Yeah.
Okay.
And then,
Any thoughts?
okay. And the selfless question is, what's the most frequent mistakes that you see in proposals? Not the stupidest ones, because we are all obviously going to avoid those, but in terms of the most common mistakes that you see.
I would just say it's interesting. When you go through the phase two, there are areas of redundancy where you almost feel like I kind of talked about this, and I'm trying. Make sure everything's consistent. I mean, it's pretty easy if the story doesn't flow to find areas where either your pro forma doesn't conform with something in your commercialization plan. So certainly, I sort of try to make sure that there's a consistency and check and balance in the various sections.
Okay.
The one thing I'll add, and this goes back to a point I made earlier, understanding your market and where you fit in the market. There's always this discussion of a billion-dollar market, but then I find that in many proposals, the identification of how it's segmented from a practical point of view is limited, and I want to make sure that people have a deep understanding of where they fit in that market and how they're going to attack it. And it gets back to Peter's point about what's the pain point and how does your solution purportedly solve that once you de-risk it and get it closer to commercialization.
Great, thank you so much.
Let's go to the microphone here.
What sort of commercialization milestones have successful companies hit at the time of their application?
Well, so of course your technical milestones will depend on the nature of the project. But if you sort of work backwards and think about what is kind of the most important milestone at the end of phase two, I think if there's clarity and focus on what your, I'll call it commercially relevant inflection point is, whether it's a prototype or whether it's something that a strategic partner would want, I mean, that's, you've got a lot of latitude there. I think milestones that build up to supporting that end goal are really, again, as a story that should make sense in terms of progression. And you've got both technical and commercial reviewers looking at the fact that, your aims within the context do make sense.
The one thing I'll add is it really depends upon what you're proposing. So for instance, sometimes you learn some valuable information from phase one that, as mentioned before, causes you to pivot. So a company that has pivoted, I don't expect that they're going to completely de-risk the technology and be scale-up ready by the end of phase two, nor do I expect that analytic equipment is going to be commercialization ready. But I want a clear understanding of what you're de-risking on phase two and what the issues are that you're trying to solve, and where that is with respect to your path forward. And to the extent that you're one of those situations where you should be ready for outside funding at the end of phase two, how do you plan to get that?
Okay, great. Let's go to the microphone over here.
So I'd love for you to just expand on that last comment. My question's really around that. How ready for commercialization are you really expecting companies to be at the end of phase two? And in particular, I know it's a different expertise, but around things where you might have a new material. And so if you're planning something that's going to be a new material for cars, going through that whole process with a car manufacturer might be 7 years between the initial testing and them actually adopting. So if you could comment generally about that, and again, also the funding that you might need to get to those targets.
Yeah, again, it really depends on the market and the regulatory environment as well. So for example, things that you put on the body, you can't actually start putting them on the body until you have some sort of preliminary regulatory approval. So we really try to think in the context of what hurdles you have to overcome between the end of phase one, which in a general sense is prototyping. But if you've got an instance where you've got a new molecule and you're trying to put it in a body, or you're trying to put it into building materials in order to increase efficiency or something like that, we really want to understand through your proposal what technical hurdles you have, what regulatory or commercial market hurdles you have, and where you are in that process and how you're going to attack them. So for instance, a drug product or a medical device that needs to go through pre-marketing approval, how are you going to fund that pre-market approval effort? I don't expect to see that by the end of phase two. I expect to see a good prototype that's ready potentially for the pre-market submission. Now, if we're talking about software, right, let's go back to AI for a second. Often the startup costs associated with that are not as significant as some of these medical devices, analytic instrumentation or things like that. So I would generally expect to see something like that potentially ready for market launch at the end of phase two, but sometimes there are significant costs associated with that, like data collection, third-party relationships, where there are costs that are outside of the norm for a software-based technology. So hopefully I've helped answer your question. What are your hurdles that you have to accomplish? And we try to be realistic once we understand those hurdles, and often we do, when everybody gets in the room, understand what those hurdles are. But how are you going to get the money in to accomplish it? Not that you have to have money by the beginning of phase two, but how are you going to attack the problem going forward?
Obin, did you have any further comments? Okay, great. Let's go to this microphone over here.
Hi, thank you for being here to answer our burning questions about phase two. My company has already begun commercializing our technology. My question is, how can we ensure that in our phase two application, this is not perceived as a negative?
We sometimes see companies that are existing companies that are improving on their own technology in some way, or doing a branch type of research and want SBIR, STTR money, usually SBIR money, to do that. I don't generally see it as a negative. If you have commercialization, it's important to understand what that commercialization is, and if you are identifying a real-world improvement that is potentially impactful, the fact that you have revenue coming in the door from other sources, including your own revenue, that can help fund de-risks the public's investment in your product. Now, on the other hand, if it looks like you want us to fund a improvement that's not terribly impactful, then sometimes we have discussions amongst the panel members as to whether this is the right place to put the public resources. In other words, we're not putting a traditional VC hat on. We want high risk, high reward in a different way than a traditional VC might take a look at it. So if we feel like you can get there without us, that is something we might discuss. So it's really a balancing act.
I'll just add real quick, if you have that scenario, just be very transparent. So it can become a negative if, in the context of what you're asking money for, there's a company behind it with revenues, with track it, that's a good thing. But it also raises a lot of questions during the review process. So just explain it, be very transparent about why federal funding is justified for this, why it's not being self-funded, and, you know, and I think that helps.
Thank you.
Great. Let's go to this middle microphone.
First, thank you for providing your time today. My question is around platform technologies. And I think we've all discussed clearly the need for focus, but I've also heard at the same time that if you have your first customer identified, the first value proposition clearly identified, I've also heard that you should have these secondary or third level propositions possibly ready, or applications ready that you would have for a platform technology. What is your view on that?
So, you know, I have to tell you, platform technologies can be a mixed bag. Certainly
Right.
that's what I've heard.
Yep.
I personally like that. It sort of feels like you have multiple shots on goal, and this is not a one-trick pony. So in that sense, I don't know if there's bias interjected, but to your point, certainly you have to focus your proposal.
Right.
But having some preliminary data that may have either preceded phase one or may not be a part of phase one, that again provides some substance to the story that this really has the opportunity to enter into multiple applications or verticals, in my view, is additive.
Yeah, I find it always depends who you're asking if it's a positive.
Yeah.
Or if I may, one more question about the AI side. Algorithm-based things are probably a little bit harder from the IP side. I was wondering if you can comment a little bit, like what typical IP strategies
The million
are
dollar
in that
question.
space. Something we're struggling with and trying to think.
So I always get this question during this discussion for phase one reviewers, and forgive me if I rant. I always rant on this question. So I'll give you a big picture when it comes to AI technologies or software technologies in general. The market is very hostile at this point from both a PTO award of patent perspective and also enforcement efforts within the courts. And that's just the reality on the ground, and that's my confession as a patent attorney to you. It's a very challenging market, and you need to think deeply and carefully about whether you're going to put your very valuable early startup resources into a patent application there. Now, there can be reasons why you want to do it over the short term, knowing that there's that challenging market. Number one, there are certain VCs who have what I call the check the box mentality, where they don't necessarily care about an IP strategy, but they are of this old world view that even if you have a patent application, you have an asset of value. My view is a little bit different. If it's an asset where you've got a 20% chance of actually enforcing it successfully, that is not necessarily the asset that I want you putting money in. So that's something that you may have to deal with when you're dealing with thinking about the long term from an IP perspective. There's also potentially the defensive portfolio development. Even though it's challenging to get those types of technology through the office now, and the statistics are quite bleak when you look at those technology art units within the PTO, defensive portfolio development can be quite important, and in particular when it comes to not only having these assets that somebody can value, God bless them if they can actually value them at this point, But also the defensive opportunity if somebody asserts patent infringement against you, you've got your own portfolio that you can look to and say, hey, you know, we don't practice your technology, we've got our own patents, and this is what we're practicing. So that's another thing to think about. But my general sense is, you know, and this is what I talk to my companies about, you need to be thinking more creatively about whether copyright protection makes sense for your software. It's relatively inexpensive. It's life plus 70 years, thanks Walt Disney. And there isn't the same pejorative view of copyright assertion versus patent assertion. Now, of course, there are different IP regimes. Copyright protection protects against copying. It doesn't protect against inventive, independent invention. So these are all things that you need to work out. But so that's my long rant. The short answer is think strategically and carefully and talk with your advisors about what makes sense with respect to your technology area, and try to articulate that thoughtfulness in your phase 2 plan. Because I will tell you, I go into my phase 2 discussions where there are others who expect to have patents there with software technology, and I'm saying, I looked at this patent application, I think there's zero chance that they're getting this through the office. So anyway, that's my rant, that's my answer.
Thank you.
Okay. You go to this microphone.
Hi, thanks for your time this morning. My question is also about a platform technology. We are developing a manufacturing process for very thin polymer films. It works on, say, polymer A, B, C. Each polymer is made by one specific large chemical company, and it can only be used, say, polymer A is in electronics, polymer B is in food packaging. So the commercialization plan we are developing is to only focus on polymer A, and then develop the application, and then go raise investment from that strategic partner who makes that base polymer. But our plan is to spin out a manufacturing startup for that particular industry, that particular polymer, with that particular strategic investor. And we're thinking about starting to go after a letter of support from that strategic partner. So it's a complex kind of model. We're preserving the other markets, other applications in the company that's getting the SBIR funding. So how does that play in your mind while you're reviewing?
So glad to talk afterwards, but an immediate question that comes to mind is, why are you investing in manufacturing? Is that going to be part of your core competency? And is that where and if the answer is yes, then that's fine. And how do you scale that? So that would be a big question in my mind with what you've said.
Sure.
We can talk about it afterwards, if you want.
No, I mean, I think ultimately spinning something out for acquisition to a big company is a success story, right? We care about commercialization as the end goal, and how it happens is less important for us. So that sounds like a great plan, but I agree with Albin. You know, what's the value that your team brings to the table? And in that particular situation, it sounds like that letter of support needs to be very thoughtful and strong, and demonstrate their significant interest in acquisition and spin out and scale up to commercialization.
Thank you.
Let's go to back to this microphone.
Thank you both for taking the time to provide your insights. It's very much appreciated. My question is a very tactical question on building the performa. We're struggling with setting the retail price for each unit of our product. And in phase 2, we want to de-risk the technology, and we've already had preliminary discussions with large publicly traded companies for a distribution partnership. They've got hundreds of reps in their sales force, but their view of pricing is all over the map. Some of them want to do a discount to an existing entrenched competitor. Some of them want to go on par. Some of them insist we should go with a premium pricing because our technology is a next generational technology. Could you comment on that, on how we reflect that in the plan?
Make a brief comment, and I think Antigone referred to it. You know, there's no right or wrong answer at this stage, but just make sure your assumptions are very clearly stated so that the logic of building that model, and I think everyone acknowledges that probably will change, makes sense. And if it makes sense to you, you're really the expert, you know this field, and if you can convey that kind of logical approach why you're doing what you're doing, I think from certainly where I sit, that's good.
Sure. Thank you.
Remember the I-Core concepts too. Like, what are the customers willing to pay and why, right? So if they knew that this product was on the market tomorrow, what problem would it solve and what would they pay? So you can even do some basic surveys to help understand this marketplace better. But ultimately, you know, if you're going to take the discount approach to create market penetration, we're going to look carefully to see how you're going to pay for that, right? If your profit margins are 10% and you're still doing R&D, that doesn't feel like that's a very strong plan going forward. But if you've got a partner who's going to put $5 million in to invest in that market penetration as a long-term JV partner, that's obviously a very different scenario.
Sure. Makes sense. Thank you.
Let's go to this middle microphone.
Hi, thank you for your time. This has been wonderful. So I want to know how you feel not just about technical innovation, but business model innovation in phase 2 applications. So during the I-Core program portion of this, we discovered that the customers want a different business model. So take, for example, instrument sales. Instead of selling directly the instrument, we use it as a service model where they send us a sample and we give them back the data. How do you feel about doing a different business model than what currently exists in the market?
So in that example, I would say a service model is not necessarily a new model in the market, right? So from that, it may be new for you, in which case I think that's a great sort of pivot and learning that's come out of your outreach. And but I don't particularly think that, you know, it's going to be viewed as being entirely out of the box, that you're, maybe ultimately you will go back to a product model, but initially while you want to have contained or control over, you know, sort of a beta stage, you want to do it as a service, that makes a lot of sense, right? And then you know, once you have that benefit, then maybe you decide that you're going to go global or go broader. So I wouldn't see that as a negative, certainly.
I would make two additional comments, particularly if you're building devices, the cost is quite extraordinary to build and then sell. So it's sometimes helpful to have that initial service model. We can call it beta, or it can be your soft launch, right? Where you're taking samples in to conduct testing and then giving the results back as your initial revenue to build a war chest to actually build the final product. So that is one thing that we've seen before, which I think is an interesting way to try to fund those more expensive innovations. Also think about the market that you live in, right? Let's remember the TheraSense situation, where a closely held technology can be looked at in a manner that can actually impede your penetration in the market and also impede innovation. So particularly in areas like complex diagnostic testing that's clearly part art, part science, there may be reasons why the marketplace doesn't accept a service model over the long term. It certainly could be a choice, but maybe not 100% of what is being delivered to the customer. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Okay, to this microphone.
Hi, I was wondering, as you individually review proposals or in the panel, how much are you sort of understanding and assessing the proposal by itself versus sort of comparing and looking at all the proposals that you have and picking out which one is the best?
I would say in the panels, certainly that I've participated in, each proposal, you know, really stands on its own merit, is discussed within its own merit. Sometimes as reviewers, we might leave a session feeling really discouraged because all of the scores were pretty low, but that isn't an impetus to say, oh, we've got to have 2 or 3 good scores that come out of it. At least that's been my experience.
Right.
You might want to add to that.
Sure. I mean, that's, excuse me, I think each program director probably has a slightly different philosophy here, but in general, we, as Albin said, we take each proposal on its own merits. And so, you know, we don't necessarily aim at a quota per panel. At the end of the cycle, we'll look and see how it shapes up in terms of the number of proposals that are likely to be awarded. But I've had plenty of panels where everything's been nixed by the panel. It happens. And I've had other panels where it's the opposite. There's a lot of good proposals for whatever reason on a particular panel. So that's just the way it happens. I mean, we don't try and push proposals over the line into the award or the recommended category just because there's nothing else there. So.
And I really want to add and emphasize that this is just an incredible process that NSF has. The program directors, first of all, each of them in their own right comes from a very broad perspective, but then the panels are also really run to allow the commercial and the technical scores or biases to be discussed, and it's very common for reviewers to, reconsider or change their point of view after a discussion is had. So, I can just say I think it's a very, very fair process that allows you, it's a lot of effort that you've put in to get a fair kind of review of your proposal.
Antigone, anything?
The only thing I'll add is we have been known, well, both of us have done a lot now, so I think we have a good sense of where the threshold lies for things that we would recommend to our program manager for funding. Ultimately, it's not the panel's choice. It goes into the queue with everything else. But we've been known to depose the technical experts on our panel on various aspects where something didn't feel right, make them sometimes defend their positions on something's not so cool as we thought it was when we reviewed it. So there's a very lively discussion that happens because we want to do the right thing. We want to really understand the strengths and weaknesses of the proposal and those big, hairy, audacious goals. We want to fund those if there's a solid proposal there.
Okay, back to this microphone.
Hi, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. My question is about how you review proposals within the competitive landscape in which they exist. So we're all trying to develop something new that maybe there doesn't exist a solution to a particular problem. And when we are describing the competition, we can do that in a broader or a more narrow focused way. On the one hand, sort of broader leads itself more to demonstrating a real need in the market and some product market fit, and narrower sort of leads to more intellectual property or first mover advantage or other sort of ways to protect against competition. And I'm just wondering, as you review proposals, if you feel that one characteristic lends itself more to moving into the phase 2. Does that make sense, the way I'm asking that?
I mean, I don't feel that there's a preconceived bias on either approach. Now, if there's no competition, then you've really got to explain that, right? That's there can be true disruption, but then the technology section should really be very supportive of that. Mm-hmm. So I think you want to think hard about a proposal that doesn't acknowledge any competition. So I would just...
Yeah, I have seen those proposals, and honestly, we have a lot of discussion about how they haven't really been honest with us about in analyzing the market, and perhaps have concerns that if we understand that there are close technologies that we won't fund it, and that's absolutely not true. We want to understand how you're going to attack the existing technology in the marketplace, and there's this pie out there, right? So I really focus on what's the big pie, and with the things that are close in the pie, how are you different in the way that you approach the problem, the ease of your solution, the inadequacies of the existing technology, and that might be part technical, it might be part commercial, but like Albin, there's no specific thing that I look for how you're going to overcome it. It really depends on what you identify as your barriers, and if you're honest about it, as far as we can tell from the proposal, and how you're going to attack those barriers, and if that attack makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. Middle microphone.
Thank you for both sharing your insights today. I have two questions. The first question is, with my company, we've been looking at domestic opportunities, but as part of our expansion plan, we're also considering looking at international opportunities, how does NSF view companies that would also look at international markets?
I mean, it's fine. It's part of your market, right? So so for example, I recall over the years there were a couple of diagnostics where getting a CE marking was going to be a lot faster than the regulatory requirement in the U.S. So having that as a go-to certainly is not a negative. The hope would be that the product is broad enough that there would then be, a global market for it. So if that's a question, we don't see a problem unless,
No, absolutely not. I agree.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference where the funding goes in order to fund the startup versus the final ultimate commercial market. And the realities of the marketplace is there are other growing markets that it may make more sense to get into first.
Thanks. And then the second question, I don't know if this is within your purview or not, but I had some concerns around the CAAR process. Specifically, we're a company that's taken on convertible debt, and I'm wondering, are there ways to, offset that convertible debt to say, have letters that say, it won't be repaid from NSF funding, or do we need to find another way to bring in more assets?
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I mean, you can do two things. Either bring it up this afternoon in the breakout session with your program director, or I'll be around after this is finished. If you want to ask me, I'll give you my thoughts on that question. I'd just rather stick to questions at the moment which are focused on the review process. That's part of the review, but it's the financial and administrative review.
Certainly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Over to this microphone.
Thank you. So you had mentioned that you looked at a patent application and pulled that into part of the discussion. What other external things do you look? Do you look at websites? Do you look at press releases? Do you ever look at social media? What other external factors do you bring into that discussion?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I do not look at the Twitter feed. I don't think I've done that yet. Usually the companies are pretty early on and they're saying, oh, we just got our incubator office, come by. It depends, right? So if I want to better, another situation where I commonly look at external information is when they're describing their competitors and how they're placed in the marketplace. That's where I'll go look at the marketing materials associated with the market to better understand that situation. So any public information is free game. We're not confined to the four corners of the document that they put together, and we want to be informed about what's happening in the marketplace. So I would say regularly understanding the market and the messaging of competitors is an area where I go look at what's available.
I would agree with that. So, make sure you're complete and thorough in your own analysis. It isn't really good if reviewers come in having found stuff that you haven't acknowledged. That sort of doesn't help.
Exactly. Okay, over to this microphone here.
Thank you for your comments. They're very much appreciated. In the commercialization plan, there's a section to describe market penetration, and the perception of market penetration, of course, is very important. So presentations that I've made to some investors tell me they don't want to see the hockey stick anymore. It's fictitious, it's made up, but then the first question is, well, what is your percentage of market penetration? So my question is about presenting that. You could say you have 5% penetration into a huge market, and somebody would say that's great, or that's really a lousy business plan because it's only 5%. Or you could choose a segmented market and have much higher penetration. So what's a good way of telling that story?
So 5% or 2% or 1% of a large market is okay, right? It could still be a large market. So if you've got revenue benchmarks already in the segment you're going into, then I think you really, again, have to have the supporting discussion. You're right, a hockey stick is, people notice that. but at least for the purposes of the application, if you feel that that really is correct, then explain it and support it in terms of the team, in terms of how you're, kind of a little bit of the, I know there isn't a lot of room, but make it seem credible. So I think for the purposes of the application, that's what the reviewers are going to want to see. Now, in some instances where there is no revenue model, or maybe revenue is not going to be forthcoming, and had a few of those, you can also think in terms of a proxy to something else in the market, either in terms of valuation or, so you're going to need to be a little creative. But again, any of those approaches are okay, as long as, again, they're described and substantiated in terms of your own thought process.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for just a couple more questions. Let's go to the microphone here.
Thank you for being here. My question is concerning IP protection. Do you think it is a good idea to apply for provisional patent before we hire attorney to apply for the full patent? The second question is that we are developing a product with a partner. We find it's hard to decide what percentage of the ownership of the IP belonging to us or our partner. Thank you.
So I think you and I should talk about your specifics later. I will say that there are some statutory deadlines for filing for IP that need to be considered based upon what's called generally public disclosure, offering at trade shows, other things like that. So there's some deadlines to keep in mind for that first filing. I've seen companies that put their own provisional in. There are reasons why that might make sense. There are reasons why it may not do what you want it to do. And then with respect to who gets what in the partnership, this is an issue that arises a lot, particularly when you're working with universities and dealing with the relationship there. In my experience, universities want 100% of the value, and then they want to license it out to you. So something that's interesting about patent protection is your co-owners, if you're co-inventors on different institutions, unless and until there's a contract that says otherwise. And that can have some significant effects when you're in the boat with somebody else and everybody has a piece of 100% of the rights. So happy to talk with you more about this, but there's some strategic considerations you have to think about when approaching the relationship when you're building the IP.
Okay, great. We'll have to make this the last question, so over here.
Hi, thank you very much for your time. I have a similar question about IP protection. Our company is licensing a polymer formulation, and our primary customer does a lot of its manufacturing overseas. One of our management team has had a similar business model, and his patent actually was stolen, and he spent a lot of time and money in what was ultimately a futile effort in fighting the patent infringement. So I was wondering, is there an effective IP protection that you can see, other than patenting or in addition to?
So let's also talk after this. There are other things beyond patent, like trade secret and know-how proprietary protections that are more contract and practically based. But there, interestingly, the U.S. is becoming, I don't want to call it overreaching, because we do this to others all the time. It's nothing new, but there is some more recent Supreme Court case law that allows us to deal with importation of manufacturing processes where the product is infringing a U.S. patent. You can also get at that overseas activity. There are some limitations. But in any event, we should talk after this.
Thank you.
Okay, well, so with that, we'll wrap it up. First of all, I'd like you to join with me in thanking Albin and Antigone for their tremendous insights. So I noticed there were some more questions, so maybe you can try and catch Albin and Antigone before they leave. But again, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I'm going to hand over now to Anna, who's going to describe